Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Case for Addressing Survivor Economic Security, hosted by Wider Opportunities for Women. My name is Sarah Gonzalez-Bosinski. I'm the Director of the Economic Security for Survivors Project, and today I'm joined by our Associate Director, Mallory Dusenberry, who will share WOW's most recent data and explore its implications on the anti-violence work you are all doing. Before I begin, I want to do just a little bit of housekeeping. Your lines are currently muted to ensure that background noise doesn't interfere with the presentation. But if you have any technical problems or questions, please feel free to use the chat icon that's located in the bottom right corner of your screen, and you can contact the WOW administrator there directly. You'll see that there's actually two WOW administrators on this call, so you can choose either of us, and we'll be able to help you with your problems. Following the presentation, we will open up the lines for any questions you have, but please feel free to submit questions via that chat function at any time, and we'll make sure to address those. We will have a short Q&A at the end of the meeting today, so we want to make sure that we address any of your questions that you have about the information that we'll be sharing. So for those of you who may not be familiar with us, WOW is a national research, advocacy, and technical assistance organization located in Washington, D.C. We have a mission of building pathways to economic security, independence, and equality of opportunity for women, families, and elders. Our work really focuses on promoting policies, practices that increase job quality, improve gender equity, and ensure that women are able to be economically empowered. You can read more about what we do in our other projects on our URL there, which is www.wowonline.org. As part of these efforts, we have the Economic Security for Survivors project. The S project focuses on training and technical assistance regarding how individuals, both at the national level, state level, and local level, within the criminal justice system, community organizations, or coalitions, or whoever is impacting the lives of survivors, how they can address the economic consequences of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and stalking, so that survivors can become safe and recover from abuse. Again, you could read more about the work we're doing specifically at wowonline.org/economic security for survivors. So today we're hosting this call to talk more about some of the data that we use that really serves as the foundation of the case we make when talking about economic security and why it is important for survivor safety and recovery. It's a consideration that any advocate or case manager that working with survivors knows all too well. It has a profound impact on survivors' abilities to leave abusive relationships or recover from violence that they've experienced. We also know that there's not a lot of great resources right now available to survivors to ensure that they're not being, that they are able to overcome these barriers. So to help us think more about this problem, we look toward the data to help to inform the debate. So on today's webinar, the particular data we're looking at is the cost of living and how it relates to income adequacy. This data will help provide an important context to the cases of domestic violence and dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. We recognize that there are a lot of challenges that limited financial resources present to survivors who are seeking safety and justice. The data we'll be sharing today really helps point to some critical elements of economic insecurity and can inform how we go about providing solutions that will reduce the economic barriers survivors face, with the end goal, hopefully, of improving their ability to recover and achieve independence. So first, I want to talk a little bit about WOW's basic economic security tables. We call them the BEST for short, and I'll be referring to them as the BEST from the rest of this meeting. So the BEST helps provide important context and is how we define the basic income an individual or family needs to be financially stable. Just to give you a little bit of background before I actually show you the BEST data. When we talk about economic security, we are really talking about stability. We're looking beyond living paycheck to paycheck. We want individuals to have some resources behind them so when they have an unexpected financial shock, whether it's a job loss or in the case of working with survivors, they need to leave an abusive relationship or get much needed medical support. All of those things are not prohibitively expensive. So we want to make sure that they have some resources that will allow them to take care of their physical, mental, and health needs. So that being said, the best expenses include housing, utilities, food, personal and household items, those basic needs that an individual needs to take care of. We also include transportation and childcare. Obviously, those two categories are critical for one's ability to work. Healthcare and savings are another couple of components that often aren't included in some of these traditional budgets, but are really critically necessary to ensure that you're reducing financial instability both in the short and long term. And of course, the last element that we include are taxes. That's one thing we can't escape. Overall, the budget I'll be showing you is pretty modest. We don't allow for any extras. We really focus on those basic needs. We don't include any debt, which I know is a pretty big consideration for survivors. Many of them accrue debt not only from economic abuse from the actions of the abuser, but also because of costs they incurred experiencing the violence. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through this. The costs enumerated in the BEST are based on publicly available data and are really based in the true cost facing families in their local communities. I should also add that the BEST recognizes that costs vary from family to family, and as you can see on the slide, we have 420 different family types based on these compositions, whether you have 1 or 2 adult workers and any combination of children ages 0 to 18 with 0 to 6 kids. So a lot of different data to look at. This is all calculated at the city, county, and statewide levels, so you can see the variance there as well. One other thing I wanted to mention, many of you are very familiar with the federal poverty line. It's also often used as some of the basis for many of the public benefit programs that you are often helping survivors get access to. This greatly differs from that, and it's a much stronger measure than the FPL. It's really a more realistic depiction of the cost families are facing. Again, this is based on actual data of what these costs are in local communities. We also, as I mentioned earlier, include healthcare as a core expense, which is really important towards security. And we include geographic variation and variation by family composition. The federal poverty line, on the other hand, is based on the assumption that food makes up 1/3 of one's budget. This may have been true when the federal poverty line was created. However, that's not at all the case now. I'm sure many of you spend far less than that on your food budget, and usually housing or some of your other larger expenses are consuming more. So it doesn't necessarily translate to today's real costs. The federal poverty line also assumes that costs are the same wherever you live. So we all know that the cost of living in urban areas are going to far exceed what you would need to earn in more rural areas. So our data allows for that. So here is our best index for a single worker. This is based on the U.S. average. As you can see here, the biggest expense that single worker is paying for is housing, followed by transportation. I also want to make note that in comparison to the federal poverty line, a single worker making less than $11,670 would be considered in poverty as compared to what we're showing those actual needs are going to be, which is $14.44 an hour or around $30,000 a year. So there's a big difference between what we are saying people need just to be economically secure and stable versus what the poverty line is showing and those benchmarks for accessibility to some of those programs that we're connecting survivors to. The other thing I want to just quickly point out before I move on to some of the other data is this: the income that we show that an individual needs is 2 times the federal minimum wage. And as we know, federal minimum wage earners who are working full-time earn approximately $15,000 pre-tax. So you can see there's really big gaps there with what we're seeing in terms of people earning versus what we actually need. Mallory will talk a little bit more about this income adequacy issue a bit later. So now we're looking at the U.S. best average across a number of different family types. So as you see, we have the 1 worker there, but we also have a few other combinations. 1 worker with 1 infant, 1 worker with 1 preschooler and school child, which is often what we see as a typical TANF recipient. We have a household with 2 workers, and then another household with 2 workers and 1 preschooler and school-aged child. So as you can see here, the cost of childcare is huge, particularly for those who are a single worker. It takes up a significant chunk of their budget. Obviously, 2-worker households do much better. It reduces their income needs on a per-person basis. So if you have 2 workers in a household, they would only need to earn $10.43 each, compared to the single worker who's would need to earn around $14 an hour just to make their ends meet. This is also a consideration that comes up with working with survivors who may be considering leaving an abuser, knowing that some of these costs that they may not be able to support themselves and their children without having that dual earner is a pretty significant consideration that many of them are making. So understanding this data and how that impacts their ability to leave, where some of those big costs are, what those barriers are, is really critically important. And again, many of you know this, but maybe some of the people who are, deciding how your programs are getting funded, whether it's foundations or, state and federal funding sources, it's important to be able to make the case that more resources are needed to support survivors. Okay, and I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of geographic variance. You can see here we have some select jurisdictions to show you just the variance that can happen with housing. For example, we're seeing one of the lows in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is $425. For those of you who are in the D.C. metro area, I'm sure any of us would love to be able to pay that amount for rent, but we're typically seeing much higher cost here, as you can see in Columbia, Maryland, where it's nearly $1,200 a month. Same thing you're seeing. There's no child care variance here because we're just looking at 1 worker, but there's, of course, a lot of variance across the states as well. So if there's any questions about this at the time, I'm just going to try to check and see if there's any. What kind of housing is used for this chart? Okay, so in terms of 1 worker, we're looking for renting an apartment, 1 bedroom. When we're looking at having children, it's typically 1 or 2 kids per bedroom. I'm not sure. I'm going to just pop back to those slides so you can see that. So that's why you're seeing changes there. The reason you, for example, you have the 1 infant and 1 worker, and then the 1 worker and 1 preschool child. You can see where the changes are there. We're keeping those 2 children in that 1 bedroom. Other questions? Quickly checking. All right. If there's no other questions, I'll move forward. I also want to mention that we have all the methodology available on the website. I'll point you to as well, so you can see where the data is coming from. I'm just going to move forward again. And the last piece I wanted to share with you regarding the basic economic security tables is looking at the cost difference between workers who have employment-based benefits and those who do not. The example we have here is for workers that are 2 workers with 1 preschooler, 1 school-aged child. You can see that there's a big difference in what they would need to be earning a year based on whether they have access to employment-based benefits or not. So in this case, it's reducing their income needs by about $6,000 to ensure that they have good retirement savings, health care as well. You can see the difference in emergency savings has to do a lot with access to unemployment insurance. So that's why those costs are different. So having access to those benefits are not only important because they can provide relief for your income, but as we all know, having some of that stability in terms of savings and also health care really ensure that survivors are able to recover fully. We all know that domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking does not know any age. We often see this happening in older survivors as well, so we are able to share our elder index that shows some of the costs that those who are retired or no longer working face. So the examples here are individuals who are out of the workplace. What should be clear to you very quickly is that Social Security doesn't even come close to covering some of these costs. Some of the annual income needs are quite high. We're seeing anywhere from $20,000 for a single elder who has no mortgage but still has to pay taxes, versus an elder couple who needs to earn around $40,000 in savings just to meet those basic needs. So that's not something that a lot of people have, and it's something where you can quickly outlive the savings that you've acquired. So this is something that we often encounter when, working with elder survivors, that dependency is much greater at that point. Often going back to work may not be an option, and they have very few resources and opportunities to really leave those abusive situations if they're dependent on that person for shelter, food, and housing, along with all those other issues that many elder survivors face. So as I mentioned before, this is just a quick overview. Mallory's about to take over in just a moment to show what the implications of this really are for you. We've shared this data with you a number of times, so we don't want to go over it too often. So all of this is now available in all the states in the District of Columbia for each county and can be accessed at www.basiceconomicsecurity.org. There you'll be able to register for free and access all of our data. You can look at a specific county and a specific family type, or compare across counties as well and across different family types, so you can get a sense of what the picture looks like for survivors you're working with in your local communities. The same can be done with the Elder Index. Both are available there. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mallory, who's going to talk a little bit more about the implications and what the data tells us.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks all of you for being here today. So as Sarah mentioned, I am going to be talking a little bit more about how we interpret this data and what we use it for. So really, this data can be used to determine what the highest expenses facing individuals and families are, where costs are the highest, who really is economically insecure, and whether wages are proving adequate here in America. So here you have a breakdown of what the general costs are and what percentage of one's budget each of these costs prove to be. We have this for one worker and then one worker with an infant and a preschooler. And as Sarah mentioned, for a single worker, the largest expenses are often housing, followed by transportation. So 25% of the budget is going to housing. And as you can see, food is a mere 11%, so very far off the outdated poverty measure that we use. When there are children present, the largest budget item is almost child care. Here it makes up 27% of one's budget when there's an infant and a preschooler involved, followed by housing at 15% and transportation at 10%. So the exact proportions will vary by geographic location and family composition. As we've discussed, we take all of those into account. This will really impact where workers will make sacrifices and how they're going to make decisions based on what their needs are and what they're able to meet of this pie. Usually wages, as we will see, are not quite being able to cover all of them. This also it very much reflects what we're hearing from survivors in terms of their biggest economic needs and, more importantly, their biggest barriers to leaving an abuser. Very often we hear that the main needs for survivors in order to make that decision to leave a domestic violence abuser is housing, transportation, and child care. So this definitely reflects that those are the biggest issues that not only Americans in general are facing, but survivors as well, and that it's impacting their ability to be independent and safe. So here we have the best numbers compared to the federal minimum wage. Of course, this will be different in those growing but still few states where the minimum wage is higher than the federal level of $7.25. But as you can see, the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour does not even come close to meeting that economic security standard, especially if there are children involved, as child care is the highest expense for a family. For a single earner, a minimum wage job covers about half of the basic budget. However, for a single earner with an infant, it's approximately a third. And this just goes to show that having a job is not enough. It really needs to be a good job. Many Americans are working multiple jobs, multiple minimum wage jobs especially, to try to make ends meet, and social supports and benefit programs often fail to make up the difference. And this is in part because the poverty line that determines eligibility, as we've mentioned, is set at very old-fashioned and impossibly low standards. So those working minimum or low-wage jobs will make these calculations and determine, they will say that I'm earning minimum wage that barely covers housing and food, and they will figure out whether to admit one of these basic needs or to sacrifice quality or even safety to make their budget work. And this type of calculation is also one of the main reasons that domestic violence survivors particularly may not leave an abuser, that they just frankly can't meet their own needs when resources are that limited. So WOW also compares the best numbers to actual labor market data on working adults' earnings and household incomes released by the Department of Labor to determine if people are actually economically secure. We did this comparison and recently released our latest Living Below the Line report this fall, which has a lot more of these numbers and comparisons if you would like to access that on our website. So comparing these rates of economic insecurity across time, it appears that the economic insecurity for all groups peaked in 2011 before beginning a gradual decrease. So indicating that the recession has peaked and a very slow but positive recovery has been in place for this economic security standard. However, while the changes have been a similar decrease across all groups over the last 5 years, the more vulnerable and economically insecure groups, largely children and women, did fail to close that gap. As you can see, men are much more likely to be economically secure than women and children. So diving a little more into that gender breakdown, WOW's analysis revealed that women are much more economically insecure than men in all categories. And women really tend to have higher insecurity rates for several reasons. One is job segregation. A National Women's Law Center report found that the 10 largest jobs paying under $10 an hour are predominantly held by women. And of the over 500 job categories that the Department of Labor tracks, 2/3 of women workers are clustered within only 23 of those occupations, and those tend to be lower paying with fewer benefits. So secondly, when women are in equal jobs, they often do not earn an equal amount. The current gender wage gap is 78 cents per dollar earned by men. And lastly, as we pointed out, the cost of childcare is huge, and women are statistically more likely to be single parents and have that cost burden. These points are important to be aware of, especially considering the higher rates of violence experienced by women in general and women of color specifically, considering all of the additional financial barriers or burdens that survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking face. It is even more detrimental to their overall economic security. In addition, when facing domestic or sexual violence, victims might not have the economic security starting out that they need to seek help or leave an abuser, creating this cycle of vulnerability. So these factors for women's economic insecurity can add up over a lifetime of working to create lower savings and fewer Social Security benefits for women, making them much more likely to be economically insecure during their retirement years. Women also tend to live longer on average than men, meaning that their savings, which tend to be lower, may also not stretch nearly as far. So this chart highlights the difficulty of finding a job that pays an economically secure wage when there are children, largely due to child care costs. It also highlights another, well, I guess the same very important reason why a domestic violence survivor might stay with an abusive partner, or why a single mom might not report being raped by her boss and out of fear of losing her job. So as you can see, a single adult with children, single parents, regardless of gender, 77% are economically insecure in America. And here we look at household composition for elders and find a similar issue that single elders, especially minorities, are much more likely to be economically insecure. A staggering 83% of elder Hispanic singles report being economically insecure or having enough savings to meet that economic security benchmark, compared to only 32% of white elder couples. So this also has similar implications for victims looking to escape violence. The ability to cover their housing, health care, and other needs by only relying on their savings may very much prove prohibitive to leaving. So here we look at economic insecurity by education attainment. And while this might seem overly obvious, education is extremely important and very much connected to one's economic security. However, it is important to note that it doesn't necessarily guarantee economic security at all. It's also very important to consider debt when taking this into account. That is one thing that the basic economic security tables do not incorporate, and that has a great deal to do with one's economic security later in life, with college debt especially being as high as it is. So education is obviously very closely related to the type of job one can get, especially when career planning with survivors. Again, it's important to consider that debt and the time frame as well. This slide also really points to the importance of dealing with the epidemic of sexual assault on college campuses and how harmful that interruption to education can be in the long term. Research tells us that student victims are much more likely to be set back or to drop out of school because of violence against them, particularly sexual assault. And as we've repeatedly seen in the news in the last year, colleges are doing, frankly, a terrible job of supporting them in a way that will keep them on track, that will keep them in their classes, that will keep them in student jobs, that will put the burden of relocating or transferring on the abuser instead of on the survivor. So those are things that we're not seeing nearly as much as we should, and as a result, many students are being set back and still saddled with that debt without even having the degree to get those job benefits in the future. The fear of negative impact on their education is also a big reason students report not reporting to law enforcement or campus enforcement, which means that they also probably won't get the services and justice that they need. So here we have the breakdown of economic insecurity for a few of the largest occupations for women from 2012. And it does vary greatly from 83% of registered nurses, which are predominantly women, are economically secure, compared to almost 90% of cashiers who are economically insecure. And as you can see, the occupations with the least economic security tend to be minimum wage or hourly with inflexible scheduling and little or no benefits. So these all point to policies that might be able to support not only survivors but workers in general, as well as what kind of jobs direct service providers and advocates, case managers, can help direct survivors to create that stability that they might be needing going forward. So as I mentioned, employment and education alone are not sufficient to really have stable families and communities. They have to be good jobs. They have to have the education has to be planned for and with a purpose, and we have to have policies in place to support families and communities when these jobs don't necessarily exist per se. or when, survivors who, through no fault of their own, have had to leave their employment or their housing, be able to support them in those times. So we also know that financial stability through employment and education is essential to escaping abuse and recover from violence, but that domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking often put one's employment and education at risk. So survivors miss work for many reasons associated to their victimization, and many are asked to resign, are fired, or drop out of school. And again, this data, as we're going to be talking about, can be used to address many of these issues going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah for a minute to talk about how you might be able to use some of this data in your work.
Thanks, Mallory. So as many of you know, this data that we've been sharing with you isn't exactly new. The data we present does actually give you concrete, quantitative evidence of some of the stuff we already know is going on. We know that housing is incredibly expensive and that transportation and childcare are some of the more significant barriers that prevent survivors from being able to attain independence and stability. So hopefully this data will help you move forward in making some of the cases that we'll be talking about further. So first we're going to talk a little bit about how this could be used in case management. We'll talk about economic justice and also promoting the resources that are necessary not only for you to be able to have the capacity you need to support survivors, but also that survivors have resources so they can move forward. So first, I want to spend a little time talking about case management. WOW has a lot of experience doing some of this work, particularly with survivors here. We have a number of tools and resources available that can help you integrate this into your work if you're interested. We have a couple of courses available online and a few handbooks and other resources that you can consider using. So when we think about using the basic economic security tables, understanding what that bottom line income you need is really critically important in determining what's going to be a good job for that individual. Often when we do budgeting in some of these settings, we're thinking about, for example, maybe this person has $1,000. How are they going to be able to, pay for rent, food, and all the other expenses they need? When we're thinking about the long-term stability of the individuals we're working with, we want to focus on what are the jobs we should be having them consider as opportunities. Where are the positions that are going to have some of the higher wages that maybe don't have some of the barriers to access? And when I'm saying barriers to access, the required education, the expense that comes with that. If there's a lot of tenure that comes with some of the jobs, some of those really well-paying jobs are something that are pretty high up on the career ladder and not necessarily going to be something you get right away. And economic security is really a long-term path. It's something you have to work towards. Very few people just wake up one morning and find themselves economically secure. Unfortunate thing, but true. So we spend a lot of time working with survivors in thinking about what their skills are, considering the labor market in the area and their interest, and try to help them identify jobs that are going to get them as close to economic security as possible. Maybe not right away, but also thinking about something where they can build a career path to achieving that goal, and balancing, any additional needs they may have, whether it's getting a degree or certificate or participating in a job training program, how that fits into that, because obviously there are costs associated with that and also time as well. So we really look at that to help inform what we're doing in terms of career planning with survivors. There's also a couple other great ways we can use it. We use it as a means of tracking client progress. So when a survivor enters the program, we're able to assess where they are in terms of how close they are to achieving economic security. And towards the end of the program, hopefully you'll see an improvement in their ability to be more economically secure and stable, whether that's through attaining a better job or accessing benefits that are helping to close the gap. We want to make sure that we're able to show progress, something that funders are always very eager to see. So that can be a really great benchmarking tool to show the long-term stability and independence of those you're working with. Also, connecting them to appropriate supports. This could be something where it'll clearly identify where they may have gaps in their budgets, whether they may need additional support with housing or with other. I'm thinking of food stamps, for example. Some of those things where you can try to offset some of their costs and make sure that they're able to be more secure in the long run. Obviously, when we're talking about true economic security, we want them to be independent of all of these supports, but that's, of course, the long-term game plan. We want to make sure that they're stable in the meantime so they can go ahead and continue to work without disruption, access the training and other supports needed so they can build those stronger careers with better financial opportunity in the future. Another big component of the BEST is those saving pieces. So we often promote the importance of saving, even if it's a modest amount early on. As you saw with looking at the Elder Index, you really need to have a significant amount of resources behind you if you're going to be somewhat stable in retirement, particularly knowing that Social Security is not going to cover all of those expenses. So the earlier individuals are able to save, the more likely they are to have some of that long-term stability. And there are some really great resources out there. The Individual Development Account Program, for example, many of you may be working with IDA programs in your settings. It's a great way for individuals to maximize their savings potential while getting some financial literacy in the resources in the process. I suspect many of you who are listening that are in transitional housing programs, shelter, or other advocate staff, you are probably familiar with Allstate's financial literacy curriculum and probably use that. Financial education is another really great way you can use the basic economic security tables and seeing what those cost individuals are going to face. Some of the survivors you work with may not have ever had the ability to manage a budget, either that was controlled by the abuser or they just never saw the money come in and out of the household. So it could be very difficult for them to get a sense of what expenses they're going to face. This is also true if they may be considering relocating to another place to ensure their safety. For younger survivors, it's really also helpful to look at this. Not too many teenagers, college-age people have actually been living on their own independently, so having a good sense of what some of those costs are going to be so they can make sure that they're, again, looking at the right career options, maybe choosing where they're going to live. All of those important pieces can really help with that by using that tool. Also, it could be part of the asset building conversation and thinking about debt management, knowing what costs are fixed versus where you can kind of cut some corners and get some savings, and how you can make up that difference with some other supports and benefit programs is pretty important. But for more specifics on some of the ways we use it in case management, please do feel free to check out our website, wowonline.org, and you can find our project where we have a number of our tools, including our case management handbook and 2 of our online courses to show how we go about using this information to build a pretty significant employment advocacy and support program. So next I'm going to let Mallory talk a little bit more about how this could be used in partnership with the criminal justice system to secure economic justice.
Great. So when we're talking about economic justice, we're primarily talking about 3 things generally. So economic relief within protection orders, and that can include awarding housing or, ensuring that the abuser has to pay for suitable alternative housing. Same for transportation, child care, child support, any of these provisions that might be within a state's statute for their protection orders, or using them through a state's catch-all provision as a basis for safety. We also talk a lot about restitution as a very strong mechanism within the criminal justice system to have the victim be restored whole financially as a result of from the impact of the abuser's crimes. And then lastly, economic justice as charging for economic crimes that were committed alongside violent crimes, so such as theft, fraud, identity theft, etc. So these numbers really can be used as a guide to think through what economic relief a survivor might need or is entitled to, especially with protection order statutes that allow for the provision of alternative housing The best numbers really can be used to guide what might be considered an acceptable and safe amount, especially since they are very median of the road, but don't necessarily take into account geography. The same may work for transportation or child care provisions in protection orders. So they can also make the case for awarding this relief as a way to keep the victims safe, and for not putting the burden on them and instead putting the burden on the abuser. So they can very easily show the impact of, say, a survivor having to move and what that impact has on their economic security. So having to pay possibly 2 rents at once while at the same time having to put up a first and last month's rent as a security deposit. So these tables really can show that would wipe out their entire budget for 2 months, and then that can really impact their safety and security. The research can also be used to show prosecutors and the courts why victims might drop out of a prosecution or not show up for hearings if they're facing high costs for court parking or alternative public transportation, if they're having to take time off of work for meetings that have been rescheduled multiple times, or having to pay for alternative child care, additional child care. So this really makes the case for reducing those financial barriers to accessing the justice system. So making the case for having having bus passes or free parking reimbursement within prosecution offices or at courthouses, for having a partnership with local child care providers so that parent victims don't have to worry about that additional time or money cost when participating in the justice system, because all of these economic justice issues we're talking about are really only accessible if they're able to access the justice system, period. So this really is a really important step for them to take. It also makes the case for paying attention to economic-based witness intimidation and charging it as a separate crime, which encourages the victim's participation as well and creates fuller accountability for the offender. All right, Sarah? Sarah, back to you.
I'm sorry, I was on mute still. All right. Hi, everyone. So I just want to talk a little bit about resources. There's a couple of different ways I'm looking at this. One, we have the internal aspect of what we as program folks need to provide survivors with the resources they need, as well as some of the larger sources of programmatic funding, such as public benefits. So in terms of program budgets, we all know that we're often asked to do a lot with very, very little. And if we're truly going to be able to support survivors to attain independence, we need to have a good sense of what their financial needs are, and that's where the BEST can help. So we all know that housing is a really monumental, just huge barrier for survivors to overcome. So if we're not able to adequately support their ability to get housing, and I know this is a big issue for transitional housing, you often don't have enough resources to help either reduce the rent that survivors are paying when you're in a transitional program or lack a number of beds. Having that to make the case that this is needed, this is a barrier for survivors who are trying to escape abuse or recover, that you can help to make the case to some of those funders about that. And it can also illuminate where you may want to direct some of your resources. As we see, child care is another large expense, and transportation. And right now there are not a lot of resources, public resources out there that can really help shoulder some of those costs. So the ability to make that argument that you need some of those financially flexible dollars can be really helpful. Very few programs have kind of that emergency assistance pool, but want that emergency assistance pool so they can help survivors just pay for that, as Mallory said, the down payment or first and last month's rent, security deposit can really make a big difference. And having that flexibility in your program budgets can be very helpful. So this tool could be used to kind of make that case. Staff needs financial security too. We often find that many of the groups we're working with are, again, doing this on a very, very shoestring budget. So it makes it very difficult for staff to be economically secure, and then, it creates a lot of instability within programs. So, it's really important to not necessarily make the case to your staff. You all know that you need more of those resources, but to the programs that are funding you, whether it's foundations or other sources, it's really necessary that you all have that stability so you're able to provide the safety for yourself, but also for the individuals that you're working with. And again, this is a really great educational tool for fundraising. It can really not only show the needs of the clients, but the true needs of what a program must have to offer the range of assistance that survivors need to move forward and be whole. So, for example, making sure that they understand that you need to have some of those job training dollars in there, or funding some of these economic and career advocacy programs, because we know that incomes are not meeting what the expenses families are facing. So the dollars are not there in the available jobs. A lot of them right now are really focusing on minimum wage work. We know that that's not going to help individuals be long-term independent. So let's think about how we can expand some of the work we're doing, and making that case to fundraisers and to foundations and other fundraisers is really important, so they know the dollars have to be going a bit of a different direction to make sure we're looking at that long-term financial stability. Lastly, public benefit funding. We all know and have seen the dollars that are going towards these programs are getting cut all the time. Housing resources are going down. Section 8 vouchers are harder to get. We see WIC getting cut. We see food stamps are often under threat. There's even the programs that are existing. The child care subsidy is very hard to access. We need adequate funding in these programs to make sure that survivors can access them, and that those programs actually are meeting some of those needs that we see with some of the child care centers, that they're not getting the rates that they require, and those public benefits aren't even coming close to actually meeting what those costs are. So thinking about how we can look at the public benefit funding. This also can point to some of the criminal justice pieces as well, making sure that crime victims' compensation is adequate. Right now, as many of you see, there's a lot of caps on some of the funding they can receive in response to some of the crimes that they've experienced and some of the assets that they may have lost. So there's some opportunities to think about, what those financial needs are there as well. And then lastly, public education.
Yeah, so really I see these tools being used for public education as maybe even their biggest benefit, second to case management. So especially within the justice system, these numbers have the potential to really educate justice system professionals, as well as potential jury pools to reduce victim blaming within the system. As we all know, that's a huge problem for victims continuing on and reporting additional crimes. So in trainings that I've done with law enforcement specifically, presenting these numbers created a level of empathy for survivors unlike anything else I've ever done. With so many Americans not even making this amount themselves, it really calls into question how we can expect victims to leave an abuser, and that's the exact reaction that I've had from especially officers who have said, I'm not making this. If this is what she's facing, if this is what she's dealing with, how can I expect her to leave or to act in X, Y, Z way? So the same goes for understanding why they might have recanted a statement or delayed reporting, especially for sexual assault. So this public education about the economic barriers that survivors, as well as all Americans, are facing also shouldn't just be limited to the justice system. It should also be extended to reach the greater community and be included in larger discussions about policy and resource allocation, as Sarah mentioned. So the research also makes the case for why educators, employers, housing providers, and others in the community should be involved with violence prevention and response, either through participation in coordinated community response teams or through direct engagement by service providers and advocates. So really coming together to show that that these costs and these economic barriers are impacting survivors' ability to be safe, and as well as the fact that the violence and victimization that survivors are facing are going to impact their ability to meet this economic security standard, where they're going to be able to, maintain employment and pay rent or stay in school, any of these other things. So there really is this community-wide investment towards addressing these issues and making sure that those gaps are filled either by, job training or resource provisions as well. So making sure that this is a larger policy conversation within entire communities. Is there anything to add on this?
No, I would say that really when you're thinking about economic security, there isn't necessarily one thing that can be done that will ensure that a survivor or anyone is truly economically secure. Well, maybe short of ensuring that everyone gets a living wage. All of these different components need to come together. We need to make sure that wages are adequate, that there are resources that survivors can access for economic justice, that the community is educated about these costs that survivors are trying to overcome, and thinking about how we can proactively come together to help mitigate some of those costs and allow them to have the options they need to either leave an abusive situation, try to rebuild their lives, or just recover in general. So all of these pieces, again, they need to come together, and it's not just the role of an advocate, it's not just the role of the criminal justice system, not just the role of the community. All these pieces need to come together to make sure that we're supporting economic security for survivors. At this point, we're happy to open it up for questions. I'm going to see if I can get all the phone lines open so we can ask questions at just a second.
Right. And while you're doing that, I also want to add in, I forgot to mention earlier, that another avenue for economic justice is crime victims compensation funds, or state crime victim compensation funds, and that this can also help make the case for why those programs need to be adequately funded and why barriers to accessing those might need to be lowered or addressed in some way. That those funds can really help mitigate the costs of violence for victims, so that they aren't detracted or taken off the path of economic security in their best budgets.
Okay, I have tried to unlock all the phones, and it doesn't appear to be working, unfortunately. So if you have any questions, please direct them to the group chat function. Okay, I see one here. Is there an effort to update the federal poverty line, the guidelines? So there's an alternative measure out there where they do include some of the geographic variants as well. It's a bit more updated, but it's still grossly inadequate compared to what we know those income needs to be. I don't necessarily know if updating the federal poverty guidelines will have a big impact on the work we do, other than maybe changing the benefit thresholds. But I still think the argument needs to be made that we need to focus on some greater levels of funding and some other opportunities beyond some of that. Mallory, do you have anything to add?
Only that I don't think there's actually any conversation about updating the federal poverty guidelines, just because there's no real political will to do so. But as Sarah mentioned, it would provide a lot more. It really would just impact the benefit eligibility.
Right, and I don't imagine any president or Congress is really going to want to be the sitting person when they increase the number of people who qualify as in poverty. So unfortunately, I think it's recognized as a pretty out-of-date measure. As you can see, there's going to be a lot of there's a lot of other measures used, such as our basic economic security tables, that are really trying to change that conversation and looking more towards income adequacy.
Right, and we're taking steps in a number of states, especially with our elder index, to really implement that as an alternative standard within the state governments, so as an alternative to the federal poverty guideline to determine any number of things regarding elders who are insecure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, that's exactly right. We've seen that used in a number of places where they're trying to use that as their benchmarking tool, both the elder index and the basic economic security table. So it's, hopefully jurisdictions can realize the value of that and understand what the real needs of their constituents are, and consider using those kind of resources as an alternative to the poverty line.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot more room for action and flexibility on the state or local level than there is on the federal.
Yeah. So are there any other questions? Okay. We will be making a recording of this presentation available to all of you who have participated and online as well. We'll also include links to those resources and some of the methodology behind them. We encourage you to look at the full reports as well. Again, these tools can be really useful not only in your work as advocates or as policymakers. It's really helpful to kind of set that framework and use this economic lens to look at domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. It's been very useful in the criminal justice system, who often may want to shy away from what they consider to be one of the more tricky things to investigate. But giving them some of those financial pieces to look at when we're talking in terms of economic justice and economic crimes can be very helpful. So we encourage you to look at some of those resources. Check out our website, where we have many other tools that could be useful for you in your work, whether you are an advocate, a government agency person, or if you're in the criminal justice system. So check those out. If you want some further support from WOW, we do offer technical assistance and training on these issues and how to actually use these resources to advocate for survivor safety. Thank you all for your time today. It's 3 o'clock now, so we don't want to take any more of your time. If you have any specific questions, you could feel free to contact myself or Mallory. Both of our email addresses are available on the slide in front of you. Thank you all for your time today.
Yes, thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.